And thank you, Minister. I'm sharing with Senator McDougall. So I'll speak for roughly 10 minutes.
10 and 6.
And then Senator
Is that agreed?
McDougall.
Agreed. Or Margaret.
So, Minister, thank you very much for coming to the Chamber. And I think this is a very, very important debate. And I hope that it is an exchange of light and not an exchange of heat, because I think far too often when we discuss military neutrality in Ireland, it's a very, very emotional issue. It can be quite polarising. And actually, I dare say, before we even start, I think our positions are probably not that far removed from one another. So hopefully this can be the beginning of what I think is a very important conversation, and one which will benefit the Republic going forward, because I think we're in a very febrile moment globally. The first 2 decades of the 20th century have seen it's the age of the preemptive strike. Whether that be an invasion of Iraq or whether that be an invasion of Ukraine, where very powerful nations have seen fit to use physical force as an instrument of foreign policy and as an instrument of power projection. And it has had very destabilising impacts, and impacts that those who engaged in those actions didn't anticipate. So I'm just going to race through the motion. That Seanad notes that Ireland's military neutrality, that not being the members of a military alliance, has been and remains a central and invaluable component of our foreign policy since the foundation of the state. And I think, whilst we can say things about the emergency between 1939 and 1945, but the state was in its infancy and was in a very, very vulnerable position. And our neutral status, without doubt, saved us from much of the destruction that was experienced throughout Europe. And whilst we were military neutral, we were not politically neutral. And we know that our foreign policy was conducted in such a way that it favoured the Allies. And I'm aware, through documents that are in the Imperial War Museum, that the Germans had a plan, Unternehmen Grün, or Operation Green, to invade Ireland. And they had earmarked units, the 4th and 7th Army Corps, and their concept of operations was to come to Ireland, come ashore around Tramore, the southeast coast, and basically to move north and basically lay waste to the country, because the Admiral Raeder at the time said that the German units assigned for Ireland would have to fend for themselves. These same units were Army Group B in the invasion of France and Army Group North in the invasion of Poland. And they were both noted under the generalship of Fyodor von Bock, who was known as General Death Wish amongst the Germans, for their brutality. So we managed to sidestep that destruction. And we have benefited from our neutral status. And yes, it is, to all intents and purposes, an expression of self-interest. And it's a very pragmatic component of our foreign policy. But I think, given our size, it's a very useful instrument. And it's a very, very valuable instrument. So it underpins our international status as an independent and impartial voice for peace. Now, I noticed in some of the media coverage today that this was disputed by many commentators on social media and responding to media articles. And they said, where's the proof of this? But Ireland has made significant contributions at the United Nations Security Council, for example, in the negotiation of nuclear non-proliferation. And our independent, impartial, non-colonial, non-imperial status has really reinforced our moral sort of legitimacy, our moral standing, and our ethical probity in trying to push these things forward. And most recently, under Micheál Martin, he managed to broker an international convention prohibiting the use of cluster munitions, which was negotiated in Croke Park. So we're seen as independent and fair brokers. And I would also say, in my own experience as a peacekeeper in the Middle East and as an election supervisor in Bosnia at the end of that conflict, on the ground, when you meet people, when you meet hostile parties, when they've established that you're Irish, their attitude changes. And if you talk, that they're less hostile, and that you're in a better position to negotiate and to save life, essentially, and to do positive pro-social things. You know, it's about the de-escalation of conflict, and our neutral status helps us in that regard. And if you ask any international journalist, I got funding from the Irish government back in the noughties to conduct research amongst international foreign correspondents, and they will all say that the most useful passport to have in a hostile environment is an Irish passport, because, again, of our perceived moral standing, our independence, our impartiality. And even in a cynical way, we know that the intelligence services of foreign powers, such as the United States, famously with Colonel Oliver North travelling to, and his confederates travelling to Iran, and Israeli Mossad agents travelling throughout the Gulf states, that their passport of choice has been an Irish passport. So and that resides in our neutral status. It's a very, very valuable, and I would say an invaluable component of our foreign policy. We recognise that Ireland's military neutrality is highly valued and cherished by the citizens of Ireland. And so poll after poll over the decades has shown that the Irish people do not want to be part of a military alliance. And Irish people have fought in every conflict over the last 200 years. The US Continental Army in 1775, 40% of the US Continental Army was Irish that fought in the War of Independence. In the US Civil War, 150,000 Irish fought in the Civil War on the Union side, 20,000 on the Confederate side. Between 1775 and 1815, 150,000 Irish served in the British Army fighting foreign imperial wars, and they're buried all over Asia, Africa. In World War I, 200,000 Irish fought in British, Australian, Canadian, New Zealand, American uniform. Up to as many as 50,000 died, as many as America lost in Vietnam. To what benefit to this republic? So there were people that were part of a military alliance determined by a foreign power. And amongst those, my grandfather's brother, Lieutenant Joe Clonan, killed in 1917 in Ypres, buried in Y Farm Military Cemetery, a life cut short. Buried next to him, Joseph Reichardt, his namesake, a German. So as a republic, we retain the right to choose what conflicts or what crises or what neighbours to assist in extremis. If we were to join a military alliance, we lose that discretion, and we lose that, if you like, sovereign control over our decisions whether or not to become involved in a conflict. So in order to vindicate our neutral status, I'm asking the government to do a number of things. Number one, and I know this is something you are committed to, Minister, more so than your predecessors in recent years, albeit because of financial restrictions, but we need to properly fund, in order to say that we are a neutral state, we need to absolutely properly fund our Army, our Naval Service and our Air Corps. And I know you've committed to invest 1.6 billion between now and 2008, but I think that's just a starting point, because at the moment, according to Foreign Policy magazine, Ireland is Europe's weakest link in terms of air, ground, maritime and cyber defence. And because of that, we are de facto not neutral, because we're depending on friendly powers and our neighbours to defend us and basically to tell us what's happening when they choose to within our waters, in our maritime area, in our controlled airspace and in the cyber domain. And I would also say, as a starting point, we need to absolutely pay our soldiers, sailors and aircrew a living wage. And I note in the briefing note for this debate, which was sent out, that there was a kind of a query on the fact that the Defence Forces are the lowest paid public servants in the state. Well, they are, because the representative associations have done extensive research, and when you factor in 24-hour duties and the shortage of manpower, soldiers are very often doing as many as 2, sometimes 3 24-hour duties in a week. So by definition, they're earning less than the minimum wage. And I know that that is not an intentional policy on the part of the government. I think it's probably an outflow of the, a peace dividend from the Good Friday Agreement and the ceasefires and so on, but it's something that we need to deal with quite urgently. So I'm asking for a Minister for Defence to be appointed, and yet again the briefing note says, well, there's a limit to the number of ministers that we can appoint, and that's why we don't have a dedicated Minister for Defence. But I would say we need to prioritise that in order that we properly plan and ensure that we're prepared for whatever happens next on this island. Because on this island, in the next 10 or 15 years, whether we like it or not, whether we're ready or not, there is going to be some sort of an all-island entity. And in that all-island entity, there will be 1 million citizens who may or may not accept our defence forces and who may wish to remain in NATO. So who's planning for this? Who are our defence intellectuals? Who are our defence planners? That's why I think we need a dedicated Minister of Defence to begin to plan for the challenges that lie ahead on this island. And finally, I've asked for a constitutional guarantee of some sort of our military neutrality. And the reason why I do that is that in the aftermath of the invasion of Ukraine, we've had several TDs, members of government parties, who've said quite openly that we should join NATO. And I respect their view, and I welcome that debate. And I think that they are intellectually honest. I'm thinking of TDs like Neil Richmond, who is very, very upfront about his support for military support in Ukraine. And I absolutely respect that. But that doesn't reflect the wishes of everybody on this island. So we have to have a debate. Others, and I think it's a very valuable and legitimate point, have questioned the triple lock mechanism, particularly the UN Security Council resolution being required. I understand. And what I would say there is that, yes, it does give powers like Russia and China a veto over what Ireland can get involved in or does not get involved in. And so I would say, in the absence of a UN Security Council resolution, we cannot rely on the government, which would have a majority, to make a decision that will always be in the interest of the people. So there has to be some other guarantee to replace the UN Security Council resolution. And I think that's a debate that we might have. What would that look like? Would it be something like a Council of State decision, having it referred to the President, who would then look at some element in our Constitution that guarantees our non-military alignment or membership of a military alliance? So it's for all of these reasons, and for all of these young people here in the gallery who would be the people who'd be asked to fight, and many of the people who've proposed some of these changes have never heard a shot fired in anger and are unlikely to do any of the fighting themselves. I just want to start this debate, and I'm hoping that it'll be an exchange of light and not of heat. Thank you.